Good morning, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving in advance. You're the stalwarts that have come to class Thanksgiving week. It's always kind of a skeleton crew here. I noticed the last class, machine learning, it was like, there were like 12 people. There's usually like 150. So this is pretty good attendance. What we're going to do is kind of gallop through a bunch of different arguments. I'm going to present the trustees' decision on divestment and dissociation of the Princeton endowment from fossil fuel companies, all right? And this is something we've done every year, but this time there's been a trustees' decision, right, as of last spring. And then Professor Capasani is going to tell us, to provide some ethical arguments that underpin alternative conclusions that people could legitimately come to when considering this problem. Then a group that's been extremely influential and has committed and smart people running it is Divest Princeton. We have two representatives from Divest Princeton. They've been here before, and they're passionate about what they do. They'll introduce themselves when they get started. And then Professor Nixon is going to talk about his experience. Professor Nixon has street cred when it comes to divestment because he was involved in the anti-apartheid fight when he was a marginally younger man. And then all of this is supposed to happen fast. And so I may be doing some whip cracking to make sure it does, because I want you to be able to express your views and to find out what you think. All right, so there are a number of different ways in which Princeton could have gone. They could continue to associate with a company, meaning they could receive grant money, allow recruiters on campus, and that sort of thing, and own stock in the company. They could associate, that is, and divest from the stock. A lot of universities have done this, continued to associate, but will still take grant money, for instance, from a fossil company. They could dissociate and divest from the company. And then I got an other there, just in case somebody wants to propose something else. And then there are two scales at which you could do this. Individual companies, you might decide to associate with and own stock in some and dissociate and invest in others. Or you could do so from the entire industry, the entire fossil industry, every single company in that domain, defined in some way, usually just producers, the ones that pull it out of the ground, but wouldn't have to stop at producers. Princeton's used to be here, that they would associate and own stock with the entire fossil industry. And then last May, it was in May, they switched to no, we're going to associate and own stock with some, and we're going to dissociate and divest from others. And they made the decision that dissociation and divestment were inextricably linked together, okay? And the argument, Professor Eisgruber says, is a moral sort of consistency argument there, all right? An ethical consistency argument. I should say in advance that I was for this position roughly, the one that Princeton ultimately adopted, because you all know that the way we can get to 100% to 100% renewables, if we get there, is to get to 80% by 2030. And the way to get to 80% by 2030 is to continue to use our gas fleet as a backup energy generating system for the country for the periods of doldrums. And so we're going to need to continue to use it, and our country, and indeed I'd argue the world, will be better off, will be worse off in the interim if we somehow prohibited that from happening. So it's hard for me to say that it's bad to produce the stuff that we think is necessary, right? Now, that doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. It just means right now. That's the way I see it. Divest Princeton has historically been over here. Many on the faculty are in that slot. Continue to associate but divest. Okay, I wanted to put up these kind of long things because this is what the university actually agreed to. Dissociation from fossil fuel companies participating in campaigns that distort that spread disinformation about climate change. So companies that lie about climate change are out. Here. And from companies in thermal coal and tar sand segments of the fossil fuel industry. We haven't talked a lot about tar sands, but tar sands, what they're targeting is mostly the Alberta tar sands. Tar sands produce oil with roughly twice the CO2 emissions, and they're selling it into a developed world market, okay? So it just, so the question is, do we really need to do that? Should you profit from that? And then coal. I actually think coal is questionable. Coal is currently lifting people out of poverty in India. They do need a transition. They've recently announced that they'll transition by 2070. I think we might want to add, maybe, some sort of a way out for developing countries that don't have an easy alternative in the near term. Second, Princeton will establish a committee to figure out how you decide who to divest and dissociate from. And it will also set a target date by which to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the university portfolio. And so I don't actually know how to do this, and I think it's probably not a well-posed problem, but we're not going to be discussing this part of it. We're going to be discussing the first part of it now, because the university doesn't even know how to measure the overall greenhouse gas impact of its portfolio, given that its portfolio has, some have direct emissions, some have, are buying energy that's produced with fossil, and all of them are buying supplies that are produced with fossil. And how do you trace all the emissions that a company is somehow responsible for in a value chain? Okay, so the guidelines that the trustees use to evaluate dissociation are to determine if there's a considerable, thoughtful, and sustained interest on campus, and that the actions of some company are in direct and serious contradiction with a central university value, and that the university can come to some consensus on about the issue. And they decided that disinformation, tar sands, and coal, thermal coal means coal for power, for electric power, were in direct contradiction to a central university value. So I'm going to turn it over to Simona now so that we can learn about ethical underpinnings.
All right, hey everybody. So I'm going to try to work as quickly as I can through talking a little bit about the structure of some different moral arguments that you might see, and you might hear these kinds of things echoed in some of the discussions that Professor Pacala gave and that the other speakers will also be talking about. So, can you hear me okay? Everyone can hear me? All right. So one thing, as is apparent of why we're even talking about it here, is that divestment is increasingly part of arguments regarding climate justice. So it's part of this kind of constellation of arguments about how to address climate change. And oftentimes you'll see multiple different kinds of arguments for divestment. Some give, of course, economic reasoning. So for example, fossil fuels are just going to be worth less economically in the future, so it's not a good investment. Some will, and we see just even in the university's ruling that there's an inconsistent set of values. So maybe a particular kind of institution like a university has a particular set of stated values, and then divestment, or rather investment continuously in fossil fuel companies will come in conflict with those, especially those that have been participating in climate denial research, given that the university's efforts are to be in education. I'm going to focus more closely today on a camp of moral arguments and offer some distinctions between them. And these are arguments that argue that we ought to divest because it's morally wrong to cause harm by supporting fossil fuel companies. So we're going to talk about these harm arguments. Another kind of camp that we'll look at a distinction between are those that argue that we have a moral duty, some obligation to do something about dangerous climate change, and divesting is then required by that duty. So these are kind of two general camps of moral arguments that you might see arguments for divestment kind of be deployed by. So I wanted to kind of put some philosophical language to some of these, and I'll be referring to that as we continue. And that's these two kind of camps of arguments. We might understand them as ones that are advancing positive arguments or positive duties that we have, and the other camp in terms of negative duties. So what do I mean by a positive argument? Well, these are arguments that generally, when it's relating to divestment, claim that we need to have divestment as a particular kind of response because it is part of a general duty to take action to prevent dangerous climate change. So by a positive duty, it's something that is required of us, let's just say, to do, right? Some sort of action that ought to be taken. And then on the negative duty argument side, we see this camp of arguments that say that we have obligations to divest. And the reason for that, generally, these arguments say it's because we have a duty to not do harm. And so we understand these as negative duties, right? A duty to not do something. And because divestment, or being involved rather in investment in fossil fuel companies, is related to harm in significant ways, divestment is then morally required or fits within those camp of duties. I wanted to say, regardless of what kind of tack you take with these different kinds of arguments that you advance, on the whole, they're usually addressed to institutions, and in fact, we're talking about universities here, but you could see them applied to individual investment portfolios. And these two camps of arguments, we're going to look really quickly to see how they hold up according to a couple of different objections. I'm not going to run through all the possible objections to divestment, and we'll see some as they come up in the conversation. But I just want to give you an example of how these two might contend with different kinds. So there's lots of different kinds of objections to divestment. Some say that divestment is inconsistent. Some argue that it's useless or that it actually might cause more harm. And some say that even an investment in fossil fuels is in fact not harmful at all. And then others argue, well, there's lots of better ways to avoid dangerous climate change than divestment, so we ought to do those. So I just wanted to take a little kind of closer look at maybe how some of these will play out when you take a negative argument approach versus a more positive argument approach. So one of the most common moral arguments for why the university, for example, or another institution should divest is because holding the shares in a fossil fuel company risks causing harm to others. So in other words, by holding shares, the university is somehow complicit in some harm caused to those directly, or at least increasing the possible risk that some subject or group of folks would be impacted by those harms. So the negative duty, right, where the obligation derives, is that we ought not harm or wrong others. Well, this has to bring up a series of questions. And mainly, this kind of questions might fall in a couple of different categories. But this is having to figure out how fossil fuel companies cause climate harms. And then how does owning shares, right, being invested in them, contribute to such harms? So if you're advancing those arguments, those are two questions that you'll want to be asking. And just to make a note, I won't go into too much, but of course, harm contribution can be complex because there's both direct forms of harm and indirect forms of harm. And we might want to see which of these are morally salient, if not all of them. So direct harm is literally like direct emissions, right? And then you have the harms that come from emissions. Whether indirect harms could be that a particular company helps to support structures that increase emissions, or has lobbying power, or provides subsidies to emitters. So investment in a fossil fuel company might not be directly harmful because that company doesn't emit, but it also is engaged with all these other kinds of indirect participations in them. So one thing that you'll want to talk about when you are taking this kind of an approach is this notion of complicity. And that can help us understand how we're connected to arms. And so complicity might involve how well we know that what we're doing is somehow connected to harmful actions, and we therefore might share some sort of liability, or it's at least something that we ought to know. So I am like breezing through lots of philosophy, but I'm 7 minutes, so I've got 1 more minute, and then I can wrap up? Or can I take 3? Okay. I didn't know if I was trying to do this in 5. And so in the case of divestment, we want to consider, when we're talking about this kind of complicity, whether we're aiding some other, so as a secondary agent, the university is aiding a principal agent, namely the fossil fuel company, in causing a particular kind of harm. And we could be aiding it in lots of different ways, right? The actions of continuing to be invested can be through certain kinds of influence or soliciting or almost sanctioning these kinds of actions. Or at the very least, by remaining invested, you might be seen as failing to prevent a harm. So there's some sort of omission that's happening there. So it's just important to note that these notions of complicity for divestment are relevant. You would have to show or know to some extent that these actions contribute to harm or at least increase the probability or risk of harm. You're to take the other tact on the more positive argument side, which is that we have positive duties, right? Duties to do something, duties to act, to mitigate dangerous climate change. So we might understand divestment as one of those, maybe not the only one, maybe it's part of a constellation of duties that we have. And so you might see a lot of arguments couched in this positive framework when you see arguments for divestment. There are philosophers such as Jeremy Moss that actually says that these positive arguments tend to be weaker. They're less capable to deal with objections than negative arguments, but those are different tactics you can take. So just to see an example, and you have these slides, so when you're studying for the exam, you can take a little closer look. But what if someone was to say, hey, divestment makes no difference whatsoever, or it's futile, or in fact, it can make things worse if you divest? Then you might understand that a positive argument might have less capability to deal with this objection than a negative moral argument. So you'd want to see which strategy would help you the best to contend with this particular kind of argument. And that could be, depending on how you're structuring your negative or positive argument, there might be certain kinds of advantages or disadvantages to take one or the other. So for the sake of time, I will allow you just to be reflecting a little bit on what you're hearing is negative or positive when we see the rest of the arguments in class today. But on these two slides, you'll see two ways in which those arguments play out against two different kinds of objections. So whether it creates more harm or whether or not there are better alternatives to divestment, how can these two kinds of camps contend? Okay, and I'm also happy to talk about it later. So I will pass the mic to Divest Princeton. They might be able to give you some exact examples of what we're talking about. So there you go.
And be sure to introduce yourselves.
Yes. You can stay for I'm good with this one if you want to. Does this sound okay? Okay, sweet. I'm Hannah Reynolds. This is Aaron Sariani. He's class of 25. I'm the current coordinator for Divest Princeton and a senior. I'll be presenting, but Aaron will help with Q&A later or something. But yeah, so I wanted to start out by just kind of talking briefly about our demands. These are the demands that we came up with working conjointly with the Resources Committee. And these are kind of our original proposal back in 2019. And so basically to divest the endowment as quickly as possible of all holdings in fossil fuel companies, to end all formal associations, and withhold all, investment and association with any companies that aren't aligned with science-based targets, in alignment with the Paris Agreement, and also reductions targets need to be verified through a neutral third-party observer. We also wanted to withhold investment with companies that have been found to spread climate disinformation. As Professor Pacala said, the Board of Trustees recommended this as well, except that the one thing that the qualifier they added on that was future climate disinformation, which is really hard to judge because oftentimes we see that the things that are coming out about climate disinformation are decades after they happened. So that's what we're seeing right now with some of the trials and stuff with Exxon and Shell in Congress. We also wanted to establish a publicly monitored body, some way to ensure that the endowment is ethically invested and that there's accountability on the stance of Princeton. And then also to reinvest divested funds in climate-sustaining assets, technologies, and frontline communities that are most harmed by climate change. So far, there's been 10 years of campaigning for fossil fuel divestment at Princeton and 5 different iterations of our group. We've existed since 2019 when 2 alums wrote an open letter. The proposal was presented to the Resources Committee in February of 2020. 15 months later, there was a decision of recommendations that were announced. And then the Board of Trustees announced plans for selective dissociation in May of 2021. And the faculty panel was established this September. So far, it's been 21 months of our organizing and waiting for responses, and a lot of procedural institutions that are put in place to kind of slow the process. And in some ways, it's very important, obviously, to know that we're having a very thorough review of what our endowment is invested in and what we're going to divest from. But also, at the same time, we have climate change as this mounting threat that really demands urgent timelines. So one of our biggest things that we're advocating for now is transparency in the process and as urgent and quick of a process as possible. I'm going to skip through these, actually, because I think those were covered. So I also wanted to talk about shareholder engagement. One of the biggest arguments for not divesting is that if we continue to invest in these companies, we can engage with fossil fuel companies. Over the past 4 decades, though, we've seen how fossil fuel companies often continue to engage in climate disinformation, continue to increase their plans for oil production, especially ExxonMobil. And we continue to see how fossil fuel companies are spending maybe like 1% of their expenditure is in renewables or carbon capture and these things that are necessary technologies for our transition. And a lot of it, the vast majority of their money is still going to fossil fuel production. So the idea that shareholder engagement is going to make that much of a difference when we haven't seen a difference for the past 4 decades is something that we really struggle with, this understanding how we haven't seen any change yet. We believe that shareholder engagement, the best form of shareholder engagement at this point, is to divest from the companies that aren't aligned with science-based targets and are engaging in climate disinformation. And that will be kind of a symbolic move, but also just putting our money where our mouth is to hold those companies accountable for their continued refusal to adapt to the climate situation we're in. Which brings me to the fact that Princeton's motto is Princeton in the nation's service and the service of humanity. And if we're continuing to partner with companies on research and on in investments and recruiting and all of these things, we can't be in the nation's service if the partners that we choose for our research and things like that are actively destroying the future of humanity by continuing to engage in disinformation and egregious pollution. So, and Princeton's part of a much larger network of over 1,300 people who have considered or have divested institutions. So there's a whole lot of them. Some of these might be familiar. A lot of them are universities, but also there's things like the state of New York, New York City, Norway, the Catholic Church, and many others. But so yeah, we believe that this is something that's much bigger than just Princeton, which is why there's so much power in divestment. And kind of thinking about this service of humanity in our research. Energy research funded by fossil fuel companies is often used as a form of corporate greenwashing, while they're spending very little money on the research itself in the grand scheme of all of their profits. They're using it to be like, hey, we care about the environment, while still oftentimes engaging in a lot of disinformation and egregious pollution and things like that. So something that we really care about is the fact that while some of these technologies and some of this research is really important, like carbon capture and storage, for especially in this transition, there's science that shows that it's only going to work in combination with more ambitious solutions. And so only focusing on the research that, like fossil fuel companies only funding research that's allowing us to continue to use fossil fuels just shows that they're in the interest of continuing prolonging their business, their industry, for as long as possible. And something else, for Princeton being a leading climate research institution, There's the question of conflicts of interest due to oil money. How are our faculty and how are our researchers being influenced by Exxon and BP and Shell in places that are giving money and giving grants? How is that affecting what research we're doing, and how much is that research being made palatable for these companies? So that's a big question when it comes to research partnerships. So as I've said, there's been a really long process to decide this, and every time there's supposed to be a decision, there's another committee that's established. And with that urgency that I was talking about earlier, this is something that's really important, is thinking about when are we going to get a decision? So we've just been through a lot at this point. Let me skip that. So I also, earlier we discussed the economic arguments. We believe that Princeton has a fiduciary responsibility to both maximize its returns on its endowment, but also to divest. We've seen this be successful in places like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which was a first mover towards divestment, who's seen better than average returns. And yes, there were big returns for Princeton this year, but that's not necessarily tied to fossil fuel investments. Brown's endowment also outperformed Princeton this year, earning 51.5% on their endowment, and they divested in early 2020. At the same time, the S&P 500 was seen to increase by almost 40%. So this might have been an indicator more of the market and less of fossil fuel investments themselves. So this is just a closeout. We believe that divestment is something that revokes fossil fuel companies' social license to operate. It causes them to reevaluate their position within society and to really have to conform to the transition that we all are pushing for. And we believe that it's the strongest form of shareholder engagement, with having $14.6 trillion divested from over 1,300 institutions. This political power is non-negligible. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, Hannah. That's great.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do was just to give a little bit of historical perspective, looking at a precedent for Princeton divesting. And so in the 1980s, I was a graduate student at Columbia, and we were involved in efforts to get the Ivy League in particular to divest. At that point, Princeton, I think in 1986, agreed to divest. Harvard took another 3 years. As you can see, this time around, it's been flipped. And Princeton is the ethical laggard, if you like. But one of the points, and it touches on something that Hannah raised, which is this question of engagement and disengagement. And there was a very strong argument from the Reagan administration, the Thatcher government in the UK, for what they call constructive engagement. In other words, that you could move apartheid South Africa away from white supremacy by interacting, by supporting, by funding them and helping them, nudging them towards a different position. The apartheid regime, and I knew many people who had access to that regime, and they were delighted by this because it was just a way of kicking the ball down the road, and they realized that this avenue of support was closed until the social movement gathered force. So it was a grassroots movement that ended up creating a culture of divestment and a culture of shame, of association, if you like. And divestment became a major force in the pie chart of actions, both internal and global, that led to the end of that regime in the early 1990s. So I think this question of engagement and disengagement is relevant. I know there are other differences between these two campaigns, but I am very cynical of the argument that you can make more substantive changes from within than from without. So when Princeton divested in response to apartheid, they said there may be an unusual situation in which the university simply does not wish to be associated with a particular company through ownership of its securities, and when such action seems required to prevent the university from being associated as a stockholder with a company whose behavior has been found to represent in substantial degree a clear and serious conflict with the central values of the university. So the argument of those, and I include myself here, who argue for divestment, is that investment in fossil fuels constitutes a clear and serious conflict with the central values of the university. Back in the mid-80s, Archbishop Desmond Tutu argued that constructive engagement is an abomination and unmitigated disaster. In my view, the Reagan administration's support and collaboration with it is equally immoral, evil, and totally unchristian. If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. And Tutu's ethical position, and he's a man with a very strong ethical compass, I believe, has carried over to the divestment campaign. And he's argued, we live in a world dominated by greed. We have allowed the interests of capital to outweigh the interests of human beings and our earth. People of conscience need to break their ties with corporations financing the injustice of climate change. It makes no sense to invest in companies that undermine our future. Already some colleges and pension funds have declared that they want their investments to be congruent with their beliefs. So what we've seen with many of these companies to different degrees is a vast disparity between their investment in change and the investment in greenwashing, as Hannah mentioned, the promotion of the idea of change as opposed to actual transformation. Back in 2001, BP helped the Tate Modern Gallery of British Art launch and fund a major exhibition. There was a big public debate in response to that as to whether the Tate should be accepting this money. And in response to that and other ensuing criticism, BP adopted the green sunburst logo and rebranded itself. British Petroleum became Beyond Petroleum. But that commitment didn't last, and they spent much more on promoting the new image than actually moving into renewable energy. And so quickly they sold off at that point many of their solar and wind assets. So, I would just say that the disparity between sanitizing their images versus actually investing in renewables. There's just a long track record of this, as I say, to different degrees with different companies, but it does affect pretty much the entire industry. And I think, one of the things we're dealing with here is also the question of trust. Whether it's your relationship to your parents, to your siblings, whether you've been in a romantic relationship, trust is very easy to break and very hard to reestablish. And so what we're talking about here is an industry with a long history of dissembling, dissimulation, prevarication, procrastination. And they are very skilled at adjusting their image to the changing climate. The changing cultural climate as well as the climate data, if you like. And so, for instance, when we had the Gulf oil spill, and BP was really trying to conceal the amount of damage that occurred there, we had a logo like this trying to compress the violence that resulted from that spill and from the concealment of the severity of that spill into this a translation, a visual translation of that famous photograph from the Vietnam War by Eddie Adams, trying to compress it into a very a centered image that gives a feeling for sustained damage as actually a kind of deep time violence. So just in closing, I would say that The industry recognizes they also have a generational problem. This is part of their current round of greenwashing. Malcolm Harris wrote in New York, it's not necessarily such a bad time to be an oil or gas company, but it's a bad time to look like one. These companies aren't planning for a future without oil and gas, at least not anytime soon. But they want the public to think of them as part of a climate solution. In reality, they're a problem trying to avoid being solved. So I think this is a very pithy account of Malcolm Harris was invited to this gathering of young people by BP. It was a closed gathering where he was appearing as an expert on millennial psychology at the time, and they were saying, you know, we realize we have a problem. What can we do to win over millennials? And he was very struck by this latest round of greenwashing. And one final point is that 1 minute, yeah. So one final point here is that I think that, I mean, one of the things that Princeton does pay attention to is the other Ivies and perhaps Oxford and Cambridge. Of those 10 universities, 7 have now committed to divestment. And the final point that I'd like to make is this question of strategic essentialism. With social movements, you need a simple message, whether it's Black Lives Matter, I Can't Breathe, the pink triangle of ACT UP, silence equals death. And so I believe that an industry-wide divestment is both the most, it's the most forceful action that we can embrace, and I also think ultimately would be the most consequential. Thank you.
So what I'd like to do first is just do a little bit of voting. And I want to do it on the board just so that, because I don't think, there isn't a right answer here, right? Oh, also, you guys should know that I am the director of a center at Princeton funded by BP. It was first funded here in 1999. I think it's the largest industrial grant ever to Princeton University. All right, and that the rules of the grant state that they give us the money up front and we don't tell them what we're going to do with it. We do whatever we want. So those are the rules, and that is also, I think it's a globally unique industrial relationship. It's certainly unique among energy companies inside the United States. So the person at Stanford was trying to get the same sort of an arrangement. She checked all over. She says, nope. Okay, so let's do. This will be some fossil companies, and this is all fossil companies. And this is divest, but associate. And this is divest and disassociate. Uniquely, Princeton also uses dissociate as opposed to disassociate, both of which are words. Okay. Dissociate is usually in the context of a chemical reaction, and it's also in psychiatry. It's a formal term in psychiatry that has to do with a change in a mental state. But for whatever reason, we have, maybe it's even a cultural accident, we use dissociate. And we could do neither here too. And so let's call this 1, this 2, this 3, this 4, this 5, and this 6. And I'd like to get a show of hands for people, which camp you're in, okay? And there is no right answer here, all right? So I can argue for every single one of these cells, right? I can come up with an argument that I could probably sell to somebody on every single one of these. So number 1, divest but associate. Anybody? There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Anybody want to volunteer why? Sure. It is interesting. Peter Singer, right, who's a utilitarian, would make this argument, all right, that, well, you're taking money from them, but you're putting it into a good purpose.
But he also could make the other
I know.
which is that we don't give up anything morally significant by divesting, so we
Yeah, no, it's the dissociation. So you're not going to take the money, but you are going to divest, right? So Peter Singer would say, take the money, right? Anyway, divest and dissociate. Who's into divest and dissociate? Which is historically divest Princeton's view, although I noticed that you added, unless you have a commitment to like a Paris trajectory, that would probably be updated to 1.5 degrees. And I certainly would agree with that, right? The trustees didn't buy that argument. They didn't go for that, all right? But my argument included that, you're right, and incidentally, BP has slashed their oil production already, plans to slash it 40%, all the way to zero for emissions from products they pull out of the ground to the atmosphere, the only oil company to do that. And I will say it's not an accident that they're the only ones that did that, right? I think a lot of it flows out of their long association with us. But nonetheless, divest and dissociate, who's in favor of that? 2, 3, 4. Anybody want to say why? I mean, I would argue that the main reason is that it carries enormous symbolic value, and that's important. The single biggest impact of a decision to divest and dissociate is to say, look, this activity has to be stopped. Climate change is a crisis. We need to stop it now, and Princeton saying that has very, very strong symbolic value. So that would be one argument. Anyway, I don't know if you'd agree with that, Rob?
Yeah, except I would probably go.
You'd go, oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm forgetting my own scheme here. Sorry about that. Let's go to 4, divest but associate for all fossil companies. Okay, 4. And divest and dissociate from all fossil companies. 21. And anybody for neither in either of these camps? Okay. So I probably didn't count quite right, but we've got a clear group in divest and dissociate from all fossil companies, which is what Professor Nixon's position is, I think. But it's not quite your position, is it, Hannah? You guys want to explain what the difference is? I mean, I was surprised. It looked to me almost as though there was a contradiction in your slides, which I think was maybe an update. Come on, you can use the mic here.
So the first slide that I think I showed talks about our original proposal, and then it kind of developed to also include this qualification of science-based emission reduction targets.
So 2 and 3 were the ones that I thought were in conflict with one
another.
another.
Yeah. So those were, I think the 3 is the qualifier. I think in general, we hold that at present, there aren't really any fossil fuel companies that have shown ambitious enough targets.
Well, so let me just push back, because BP's target that they announced in August of 2020 is that they are moving at a faster than linear pace, so that by 2050, there will be no emissions from anything they extract from the ground. And so that is an argument that has the ethic of reciprocity behind it. If every oil and gas company does what they propose to do, then there will be no emissions at all from oil and gas. So does that not qualify?
I think that some of our original proposal, which I think says up here, is that the history of climate disinformation is something that we have concern with. So I think most companies fall into one or both of the categories of either not falling into the science-based targets or not having engaged in climate disinformation. We don't really subscribe to the Board of Trustees recommendations of future because we think that's too long, and also that doesn't hold companies accountable for past actions.
No. Say too, if you take a no harm argument, right, you can then cut along. So one option here, right, is if you take those negative argument approaches that we ought not to do harm, the pushback, I guess, to Professor Pacala's point about BP saying no emissions coming out of the ground is that indirect harm is still there based on the kinds of work that these companies might be doing besides their own direct emissions. So that would be one particular strategy to go where there's still certain kinds of like harm affiliation.
I've got to tell you, I'm on this committee that decides what the criteria are for bouncing. And of course, the way you do this is you know what all the companies' positions are, and you look at where various discriminations would put, different companies on different sides of the divide. And I heard an advertisement this last weekend that was urging New Yorkers not to support a New York resolution to demand that there be heat pumps because it's going to cost you thousands of dollars as a renter, right? And in fact, the resolution is that only new builds should be built with a heat pump instead of so that it's consistent with the climate change trajectory, and it isn't going to cost anybody anything, right? So it was deliberate disinformation, and I bet you can guess what company was behind it. All right, so, and that's as current as it gets, folks. Okay, so does anybody have any specific question that they want to ask or anything that they'd like to say on this? And don't be shy. Yes.
I was wondering from the perspective of people on the committee and on the Board of Trustees and so forth, how the fact that other peer institutions have divested is kind of considered, because I guess from a PR standpoint it does look pretty bad, but it seems like that's not enough to really drive them to this decision. So does it just not matter as much to them as it matters maybe to the layperson concerned about Princeton's reputation?
Yeah, so the simple, as I can speak for someone who enjoys working here, it's deserved institutional arrogance. We think our decision is better, right, is what I think they would say. And there is some track record for this because most other universities, for their operational emissions, include assets that are off-site, like a wind farm or a solar facility, that they somehow draw a circle around and says, that's ours, but our endowment isn't ours. We don't measure the emissions from our endowment, but this other asset we're going to include. And Princeton decided not to do that, and they decided to invest in world-leading technology, including the largest installation of a facility that actually extracts heat from the environment and stores it in the ground to extract later for winter, and extracts cold and puts it in the ground in the winter to use it later in the summer, and have sequential heat pumps to step this stuff up and down. So we decided instead to put our money where our mouth is and actually build a cutting-edge net zero emitting power plant. And we're the only ones at the time to do so, okay? And so this is the same sort of decision, is that there very much is a view that this isn't about PR for the university, but it's about doing what is considered in some defensible right way the right thing to do. I should also say that the university endowment managers aren't worried about this at all. 6% of the endowment is in fossil, and 1% of the endowment is in big fossil, all right? And so they just don't think this is a big deal. It's really a moral and ethical issue. Anybody else? Well, thank you, and have a great Thanksgiving, everyone.